Our first afternoon presenter has been a consultant, coach, designer, and analyst and developer for over 40 years. He has been involved in the full development lifecycle with experience that ranges from architecture to support, from basic to Ruby. Please welcome on our virtual stage, Seb Rose. The title of his presentation is DevSecOps. What does it mean and where is it taking us? Stage is yours, Seb.
Thank you very much, John. Hello, everybody. My name is Seb. Can you hear me? Yes, good, excellent. So the session is called DevSecOps. What does it mean? Where is it taking us? I'll launch into it in just a second. My background is most recently with Cucumber and Cucumber Limited, the company that helps implement behavior-driven development across the world. And we've been acquired by Smartbear. And so I now work for Smartbear as a developer advocate. So let's fire on in. I've got 3 sections in this agenda. First off, I would like to talk about DevOps, because DevSecOps to some extent is an extension of DevOps. And I'm fairly sure that everybody on this call has at least come across DevOps, even if DevOps isn't something that your organization is practicing on a daily basis. So what is DevOps? If we were all in a room together, I would ask for answers from the audience. Unfortunately, this is virtual. You've got no way of interacting with me, so I can't hear your answers, although you may be shouting at the screen at the moment that exactly what you think DevOps is. However, in reality, there's no universally agreed definition of the term DevOps. It came into being a number of years ago, and there's been a lot of discussions about what DevOps means. And as DevOps has been adopted by more and more organizations, as it's moved across the adoption curve, its shape has changed quite a bit. I think things that people can agree on is that DevOps has got some things that people generally look for. There's workflow automation, there's rapid feedback. What we're really looking for is bringing the developer community and the operations community together, rather than having silos that separate them. And so shared ownership, rapid feedback, workflow automation, these are all part and parcel of DevOps. Personally, it seems to me like over the past few years, DevOps has become more about tools than it has been about culture change. And I think that's a shame. And I think that's to some extent removed and reduced the value of the DevOps label or brand. There was some research done a few years ago by Basfever and Zhu, and they came up with a nice little quote which kind of encapsulates things. DevOps is a set of practices intended to reduce the time between committing a change to a system and the change being placed into normal production while ensuring high quality. So this feels like we're trying to increase the amount of the number of times we can release, increase the speed of delivery without sacrificing quality. And this is generally the underlying value statement that most organizations buy into when they begin their journey to adopting DevOps. DevOps was probably summed up most memorably by this really influential business novel that came out of the US. It's an idealized transformation story. The Phoenix Project is, it's an enjoyable read. It doesn't feel real to me when I read it, and it still doesn't feel real to me, but it does get across sort of some of the links between the IT delivery process and manufacturing. So it's trying to borrow some of the theory of constraints understanding from manufacturing and apply it in the software workspace. And for that purpose, for that reason, it was extremely influential, and it still remains an excellent book. I've put US in brackets because it's a very American book. I don't mean this in a bad way, but it has a sort of a sentiment to it that I don't know about the folk who are listening, but certainly to us in Britain, it was a little bit alien. A couple of years later, a New Zealander who was living in Scotland wrote this book called Rolling Rocks Downhill. This focused on slightly less industrial context. It was set in, it was another business novel, this time set in a bank in the financial sector. And again, it follows the adoption of DevOps mentality to a software development process. And for me, this was inspired by the Phoenix Project, but it came across, it landed better as an explanation of DevOps and its adoption in a software context. But what are we looking for from the outcome of adopting DevOps? Well, there's a third book that I'd want to recommend to you, which is Accelerate. My guess is that most of you have already heard about it if you haven't already read it. And Accelerate is based on years of research by Nicole Forsgren and Jez and Jean Kim, as they researched organizations that had adopted DevOps, and they were looking at the sort of metrics that you could track to see how your DevOps adoption was going. And these 4 metrics are wrapped up here on the left. So we're looking for a shorter lead or cycle time. This means that when a request comes in, it should take the amount of time it takes from going to essentially approved for delivery, approved for development, to actually being delivered. That should reduce. You should be able to deploy more frequently. This means that you'll be able to deploy maybe daily, maybe many times a day, but moving away from the legacy way of deploying every quarter or every month. We're looking for a shorter mean time to restore. So that means if something goes wrong, we should be able to get a fix in there really quickly. And of course, having a short lead time and having a very high deployment frequency both contribute to being able to restore more quickly, because if you need to put a fix in place, well, you can get that fix in place faster, you can assure the quality of the fix faster, and because you can deploy essentially at will, you can deploy as soon as that fix has been developed. And the fourth metric that they recommend us we track is the change fail percentage. And that means what percentage of your deployments lead to a failure being reported. And that should go down. So I hope you can see that these 4 metrics all encapsulate something that is of value to modern businesses, especially when they have to react to changing requirements, in a very volatile world context. Unfortunately, most of the transformations, or maybe most is overstating it, many of the transformations that I've seen are just simply a renaming of the ops team into the DevOps team. I'm completely aware that this is my personal and excessively cynical perspective on the DevOps world, because there have been many successful adoptions of DevOps where Dev and Ops work together, not as 2 silos, but as a collaborating expertise, set of collaborating expertise. However, there are many organizations where it's just a simple renaming of the ops team to the DevOps team, and there's still no true collaboration between the development organization and the DevOps team. And we may have more automation, so we may be using CI to deploy our software, but that deployment is controlled by the DevOps team, not by the development team. And there you get all of the barriers and loss of information and misunderstandings and misinterpretations that come from having 2 separate silos that fail to communicate on an effective basis. The dream, however, is that DevOps brings Dev and Ops truly together, so that the team owns both the responsibility for developing the software, for testing the software and assuring its quality, for deploying the software through the stages to production, and indeed for monitoring and maintaining the software once it's in production. This is a big job, right? Many developers are highly skilled, know a lot about CI pipelines, but they may know less about scaling it while it's in production. They may know less about monitoring defects when they occur to a live system. And as such, what we have to do is extend that knowledge, that experience, and give the team all the tools that they need to be able to manage the system. This doesn't happen very often. I worked for a while for a company that you may have heard of called Amazon. And in Amazon, each team truly owns its component, its application. They start ownership actually while the requirements are being generated. They own the development, the tech stack on which the development takes place. They own all of the quality assurance and testing of the software. They configure the deployment pipeline. They budget and resource the containers and the resources needed to operate and run the product when it's running on the Amazon platform. They monitor the software once it's in operation, and indeed every team has an on-call phone that goes through a rota, and they take that home and have to commit to being available 24/7 for a 7-day period. And this engenders a real sense of ownership among the team, because they know that if they muck up early on the process or they have misconfigured the production, they're going to end up getting calls in the middle of the night, which is disruptive and unpleasant. And so that gives a great deal of responsibility to that sort of team. I say this is living the dream. I don't know whether you think this is living the dream or living the nightmare, but this is anyway the intention of the DevOps mindset, is to try and ensure that operations and dev work together as a coherent team that collaborate on a regular basis. Trouble is, when you come to scale that dream, you get some issues. So within Amazon, as I said, that everyone owns their own tech stack. And if you were, you can choose whether you develop in Java or C# or whatever. You can choose that technology. But what can you imagine if each team could choose a different continuous integration pipeline, or each team chose its own monitoring software? What we'd end up with is a huge morass of different ways of running the system that would make it really quite difficult for people to move between teams. And people do need to move between teams. You might end up with different service level agreements. You'd have different licensing that you would need to do when security updates for particular CI pipelines or particular monitoring platforms came out. Each team would have to identify and apply those updates themselves. So scaling that ideal of having a team owning its own infrastructure is really quite challenging for a large organization, because although we don't want to stifle creativity of our developers, our testers, our operations engineers, what we do need to do is ensure that we can do things in a predictable way to some extent. And so what Amazon did was it had a very significant platform team that created platform tools that were used by the development team to configure their operations pipeline and their CI pipeline and their resources with which the application was executed upon. And what this allows us to do is it allows us to give the development team all of the tools needed to control the deployment and execution of their application, but only within guide rails that have been defined by the ops team through the platform tools that they're providing. So Amazon had a very rich ecosystem of platform tools. They were highly usable, easy to configure within the constraints that the organization had decided on. And in the world of CI pipelines and cloud infrastructure, This is really useful for ensuring that you manage and monitor costs, for instance, and you have a uniform way of getting your products into production. So that was DevOps. And as I've said it a number of times, DevOps was so called because it's a merging or bringing closer together of development and operations. In the past couple of years, DevSecOps has become a term that you will probably have heard by reading on the internet or conversations with colleagues. And this clearly comes out of the observation that security of our software applications deployed in the cloud on public infrastructure or even on private infrastructure, security has become an increasingly important concern. And what we didn't want to do is have to go back to the old siloed model where developers write the software and then security go and check to make sure that the design and implementation of that software is secure and conforms to well-known security practices and takes care of all of the vulnerabilities that we become aware of, and then we pass it off to ops. Because this traditional siloed way of working, as I said earlier, has communication issues. It has misinterpretation and ambiguities that happen when silos try to communicate between each other because their terminology, their experience, their context, they're all different. So DevOps was trying to get away from the silo between dev and ops to move away from runbooks that became incorrect and out of date. And DevSecOps, again, is trying to bring that agile dream together where there's one team that has full responsibility for all aspects of the reliable running of the application under development. So dev take care of development and initial testing. Security takes care of making sure that the application is secured, and ops gets it into production and makes sure that it stays running in an acceptable way. But there's a problem here, right? Because in an agile team of 7 plus or minus 2, you've maybe got up to 9 people. And yet what we're saying is we want in that team to have people that are sufficiently experienced in development, testing, security, and operations to be able to develop, deploy, secure, and maintain our applications in production. Now, it's not feasible to have one or several individuals that are skilled, deeply skilled in all of these areas. It's also rarely necessary to have highly skilled security or operations professionals that are only living on one team. That is to say, these skills are highly valuable, but each team doesn't need a full-time person that has those skills working with them. So what do? Do we have security and operations experts that aren't team members? They are more resources that get shared between many teams, which leads to it leads to context switching. It leads to competition for those people's time, and then leads to the natural problems and issues that happen when that competition takes place. So what is the solution here? Well, I guess the first thing is to recognize that security, operations, and development, although they're all necessary for quality development of software that is then secure and operated in a useful way, though the knowledge and the concerns of the people that get involved in these different aspects of software development and delivery are orthogonal. That is to say that although you may have some knowledge of development, if you're a security expert, you may not be an expert in developing or testing software. And that if you're an expert in configuring CI pipelines or Kubernetes or cloud providers, well, you may not be an expert in the latest security vulnerabilities or updates of various open source components that you would expect a security expert to be involved and up to date in. And so the the challenge here is to try and find a way of organizing our organizations so that we don't have massive silos between these different areas of expertise, but equally, we don't have teams that have underutilized skilled professionals working on them. So an agile team of 8 people that has maybe 4 developers, 2 testers, a security expert and an operations expert on it, that would be an ideal team. But in general, I would expect in that situation to find that the operations expert was not using their operations skill to the best of their ability, and that the security expert equally would likely to not be applying their expertise to the full capacity that they had. And so really what this is it's a question about how are we going to get this collaborative environment where DevSec and Ops feel like they're working together, but without either separating them out into silos or having people whose skills are not being utilized to their full extent. A few years ago, a man from GitLab did some research into security itself, and he asked a number of people who owns security. And these are 4 of the answers that he received. So one is the dev team is trusted to do its own security research and implementation. Now, as I said in the previous slide, where I showed that security was to some extent orthogonal from development, this is really hard to do. If you're focused on development, trying to stay up to date with the latest research and security is going to be very hard. Another answer was there's a security team, but it doesn't involve face-to-face with us, the dev team. So we just run the dev process without counting on them. That's a description, certainly the way I read that. This is a description of a siloed operation where the security team is a separate external entity that maybe runs security scans and occasionally comes back to the development team and gives them work to do, saying, you've got to fix this or we've got to fix that. But in this siloed way of working, we're going to find waste because the security team probably won't be looking at your development work on a daily basis. And therefore, by the time they come to you and say that there are some security implications, you may have to do some rework, some re-architecting, and that's a big deal. At the other side, this silo means that we're going to have miscommunication. It's entirely possible that the security team is going to ask for the development team to do some security mitigation work, and that security mitigation work is to some extent misunderstood, and either the development team do too much or too little, and we could start going around this a sort of email cycle where one team asks for something, the other team, to the best of their ability, does it, but don't quite achieve what was being asked for. And this is a waste of time, a waste of effort, and a waste of money. Then on the bottom left, it's, I regularly put security suggestions in the box of suggestions only to be ignored. This is another description of a siloed mentality. We're not talking to each other. There's a channel of communication that's been opened up and defined, and yet it's not being utilized effectively. And finally, there's the I guess this is a classic victim statement. I'm the only one who actually cares about security in my organization. And I'm sure you've seen this hero mentality before. There are people who are put in a stressful situation, they're given responsibility for something, and they feel like they're in their own ivory tower and that nobody else cares what they do or how they do it. So these were four sample responses that I pulled out of this report. And I hope this, to some extent, that some of these, they chime with you, that you recognize them as different extremes of how security and a development team might work together. Another thing to bear in mind is that we can try and give people guidelines, so we can write out the standards of what they should do to ensure that their software is secure. We can write out requirements about how they should configure their cloud provider, how we should monitor software, how frequently the logs should be checked, or how how severe a defect has to be before an automated on-call alert is sent out to whoever's supposed to fix and nurse the application in production. But in reality, when the pedal hits the floor or when the rubber meets the road, people will do what they need to do to get things achieved in as quick a time as possible. In the world of urban architecture, this is called paths of desire or desire paths, which is you can fence off an area or you can mark out an area for people to walk on, i.e. a path. And here this is shown by the pavement or sidewalk. But if people want to get to where they're going quickly, they will often ignore your architectural guidelines. They will ignore the layout of the streets, and they will cut their own path where they're going. And this is what you see here. The designers have given us a sidewalk. You can very easily get to where you're going by going down the sidewalk and turning left and following another piece of sidewalk. But we're humans. We want to get to, we want to deliver the value that we think is being asked of us without, as quickly as possible. And despite being given guidelines about how best to do it or how our organization would like us to do it, we will cut corners. And we cut corners all the time. And this is one of the problems that you get when dev, sec, and ops are separate, where each team has an understanding of what needs to be done that is laid out by guidelines, but it has a very weak enforcement or at least a weak monitoring environment. So we don't know when we have left the sidewalk and are now cutting our own path across the grass. So I talked earlier about how at Amazon we had ops as a platform team that created platform tools to allow each individual developer team to manage and design their own operations pipelines, but using tools that had built-in guide rails that you were not able to stray outside of. And I didn't see this as a security tool while I was at Amazon, but subsequently with other companies that I've consulted with and worked with, I've seen them develop security tools that give development teams notifications as part of the build process, when architectural decisions compromise security, when components, open source components that they depend on have new releases that satisfy or mitigate risks and weak security vulnerabilities that have been discovered. So the pattern is the same. What we want is to take the people who are expert security professionals or expert operational professionals and give them the responsibility for creating tools that are self-service, used by the developer teams, that will give them enough flexibility so they don't depend on a synchronous basis on the security or operations professionals, but give them the guide rails and the functionality to be able to deploy these themselves as they need them. Now, the way this diagram is laid out, the arrows from ops and sec are going left to right. And that's not enough. What we definitely need to do is we have to have two-way communication. So to get to a point where DevSecOps, or indeed DevOps, if we're still working at that level, can truly deliver the benefit and the value they are so able of delivering, we need to have the development teams involved not just in using the self-service tools, but also in specifying them. So there has to be a formal and defined interaction process so that developers can raise requirements on the ops and security teams to put functionality into their tools, as well as that the imposition or provision of guide rails by the ops and security team in the tools that they give to the development teams to use. And I would call this developer enablement. What we have here is a really collaborative way of working that makes the best use of each individual's expertise, experience, and also of their enthusiasm. It decouples operations, security, and development to work at their own pace, but it prevents silos from being created, and it prevents teams, or at least limits teams' ability to contravene organizational guidelines. So finally, what's in a name? There's a Shakespeare quote, William Shakespeare, I'm sure most of you have heard of, and it goes, a rose by any other name, it would smell as sweet. So the fact that we call somebody, a team or an organization or a person, a DevOps engineer or DevOps team or a DevSecOps team, or indeed just a platform team, it doesn't matter. The name itself is something that is not important. It's what the teams or organization are able to achieve and how they can enforce their consistency. Here we have Magritte saying, this is not a pipe, right? The name is not the thing. So whether you call yourself DevOps or DevSecOps as an organization, it's not important. You can call yourself that and still work in silos. So ignore the name, look at the behaviors of your team, look at the behaviors of the different professionals that you work together. Are they collaborating? Are your organizational requirements being, I'm going to use the word enforced, it's not a nice word, but are they being enforced? Do teams comply with them? Don't get hung up on the name. However, names are important. I strongly recommend any developers go read this paper by Arlo Belshi. But the bit that I want to pick out here is that at stage 4 in his process, he talks about getting naming to be completely honest. If your team is an operations team that is siloed, and then on Monday they come in and it's called a DevOps team, that is not honest naming. And although the name is not important, by calling an operations team, or renaming an operations team a DevOps team, you are A, not being honest, you are B, potentially confusing people who are looking in from the outside, and C, you are devaluing the term of DevOps or DevSecOps. So although the names don't define what you do, if you use the wrong name for something, it brings misunderstanding much closer to the surface, and it harms the industry as a whole. So honest naming, I believe, if you have development, security, and operations all being implemented by a single team, that's honest naming. That team is a DevSecOps team. I believe that if you have ops and security teams that provide tools that are specified and used by the development community, that is honest naming of DevSecOps. If you have a silo where developers develop code and then they throw it over a wall to another siloed SecOps team, that's dishonest naming. That's not what we want. So my takeaways for you is that the name is not the thing. Names names should describe what something does, but in fact, they frequently don't. None of this is free. Maybe it's not even cheap. Having ops and security platform teams delivering internal tools that development organization can self-serve, can help specify, and can keep them within guide rails of the organization takes time and money. But like so many investments, they deliver value for money. They deliver savings in the long run. The platform teams themselves, and here I'm including ops and security, that facilitates delivery because the teams can self-serve as they need without waiting for experts to be made available to them. And because they implement consistent guide rails across the organization, it helps for scaling as well. These are process changes. They're not side effects of just renaming a team from dev to DevOps or to DevSecOps. You have to plan for them and you have to manage them as they go through. I've got a little bit of a request for you before I sign off. We're continually at Smartbear looking for ways of helping teams and organizations work better with tooling to deliver consistent experiences that mean that the products that you as a team ship to your customers are more fit for purpose, and that you can update them and upgrade them on a regular basis. I would be really grateful if some of you would volunteer to take part in the customer experience panel. You don't need to be a Smartbear customer, and the link at the bottom, bit.ly/SB Expo QA, will take you through to a volunteer form. And with that, thank you very much. I've been Seb, and if there are any questions, John, I would be happy to take them.
Thank you, Seb. Thanks for that interesting presentation. To be honest, as someone that's not deeply involved in the IT world, I have to say I'm actually shocked that the development and the security haven't always, or especially in this day and age, haven't practically been one operation and they work together. So that was a very enlightening presentation. Thank you very much. Let me check Slido to see if there are any questions. Unfortunately, I don't see any questions at this point in time, Seb.
Fair enough. So can I say to the audience, if there is an audience, because that's really hard for me to tell, if anyone is out there and anyone does want to ask questions, my Twitter handle is on the screen, my email is on the screen. I make this very, very cheap offer every talk I give, which is please get in touch with me if you have any questions, either about what you heard today or about anything to do with behavior-driven development. I say it's a cheap offer because nobody ever gets in touch. So excellent. Thank you very much for inviting me to Craft, and I hope you have a great conference.
Okay, Seb, thank you very much. And I hope you're going to be hanging around a little bit. So if somebody does write, either hop in on Slido that you will receive their question and then you can give them answers.
I will try to do that. I'm afraid I'm traveling today. So if anyone does put a question on, hop in on Slido, and I'm afraid I don't get around to answering it, please take a note of my Twitter handle and my email address.
Okay. Very good. Very good. Thank you again for taking the time to present to us. Wonderful presentation.
Thank you very much.
Super. Enjoy the rest of your day.
Thank you. Bye-bye.